mean, Christ charges the apostles in the gospel, go forth and baptize the nations. There's a missionary dimension that rubs up against. Or we can see it in the attempt to kind of replace the philosopher king of the republic with theologian or ecclesiastic kings, right? But I think in terms of your question of how you respond to that, Ratzinger actually does, or Pope Benedict does a fantastic job of that. He picks up on Augustine's key insight. If there really is, or one of Augustine's key insights, but certainly I think the kind of critical insight in the City of God is this. Christ has revealed the true end of man, and Christ has revealed the way to the true end of man, and Christ is the way to the true end of man. And what was once seen as a fictive and fictional society is actually a living, right now society. That's realism. And what the interesting thing is that realism, recognizing that hope, that desire isn't in vain, but that it actually exists, and the object of that hope exists, and we can participate in it mysteriously in some way. We hope, we pray we can, right? We hope, we pray that we do. Augustine's pretty clear on that too. It's hard to tell. Don't kid yourself thinking that you know who's inside and who's out, including yourself. And he tells you that right at the end of book 1. But if that's the reality, that allows us then to kind of live and order reality as we experience it in ourselves, as we experience it in our families, as we experience it in our communities, as we experience it in our civil societies, as we experience it in the world writ large. Benedict really does pick up on that in Spe Salve and in other places, right? His wonderful book on eschatology does this. His book on the liturgy does this in spades. It doesn't come out right away, but when you step back and look at it, you go, wow, right, on this score. And it really, I think, in some ways comes down to this, that the theological virtues, and in this instance, at least in Benedict, hope and love, right? Those two in particular are what allow human beings to live in the world in a way that recognizes their own limitations, our limitations, individually and collectively, and yet not despair to the point of saying, look, there's nothing we can do to improve the world or improve our lives, but we improve our lives through actually improving concrete persons and human beings, beginning with us, and not trying to reform institutions and societies simply. I think that's one of the things we see on college and university campuses today. But rather to kind of look inwardly and to see this call for conversion and to see what the call for conversion contains and entails. And yet hope and love are precisely the keys for this. You know, he's got a wonderful line in Spe Salve. I'm going to not quite get it right, calling it up. It's my copy. It's on the right-hand side, about a quarter of the way down. That science cannot redeem man. Yeah. Love redeems man, right? And it's a really pithy line, but when you start to prod and think about it, it contains, I think, really the response to your question. Right. In other words, love as a response. Love is something that we seek. Love is something that we give. The love of God, right, and what we receive through the love of God, both through creation, through grace. That allows us to live, interestingly, with imperfection, right? Because we recognize we are not perfect. We're not the source of perfection. We're not even the source of our own being. That we can't do anything without God. I'm not walking down a Lutheran line on this score, but nonetheless, we really, and Augustine's big on this, right? We can't. And yet at the same time, it also, this love and this hope, give us concretely the virtues, the ethos, and the ability to move towards perfection in fits and starts, always in fits and starts with stumbles and falls, but to move. In other words, not to be paralyzed and not to have exaggerated expectations. And I think that's the great thing, right? The great thing, and also the tragedy when those aren't the place. You know, we see this kind of rejection of anything other than utopia enters and issues in despair. But the interesting thing is despair is a response, right? Despair only makes sense if we previously had hope. No one starts in despair. And certainly no one starts in despair and then is agitated, right? Because if you're going to start in despair, you're turned inward and paralyzed. Despair is a kind of fit one has in one way, shape, or form when one's hopes aren't realized and we don't quite know what to do with this. But Ratzinger really makes clear, Benedict really makes clear, and Space Alvey in other areas, that despair is not the starting point nor the ending point, and that a realistic understanding of eschatology as opposed to utopianism is what allows us to live this side of the eschaton in an imperfect, fractured world with imperfect, fractured, and broken people, including ourselves, in a way that doesn't paralyze us, right? Precisely through picking up the way of the gospel, right? Through the grace, through sacraments, through faith, hope, and love. And that's not just a powerful message, that's a true message, right? I'll end on this note. The interesting thing is to see how do you translate that or transmit that, not translate, but how do you transmit that to society at large? I think one of the ways of doing that is witnessing to it. Sounds simple. It doesn't change institutions. No one would actually be, I'll say this out loud, no one would actually be having encampments for witnessing, but that actually affects far more change. I'll leave it at that.